Imagine you're a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, and today, you've been given an assignment that chills your soul. Before you lies the pharaoh's beloved wife, her body resting cold on the polished alabaster slab. But this isn't an ordinary mummification. The priest's orders are precise, and their purpose unspeakable. You are to preserve her in a way that violates every sacred oath you've ever sworn to the gods. This isn't a myth. It isn't an exaggeration. It was the living reality of Egypt, a civilization that hid its darkest rituals behind golden crowns and sacred hymns. We celebrate its pyramids, its art, its gods of death and rebirth. But what they never teach you is how those same gods demanded acts so intimate, so twisted, that later archaeologists destroyed the evidence to keep it secret. Because what happened in those temples wasn't love, and it wasn't worship. It was something far stranger, a system where sex, death, and divinity merged into one forbidden ceremony. This is the story that museums refused to tell. And once you hear it, you'll never see ancient Egypt the same way again. For thousands of years, the world has romanticized ancient Egypt as the birthplace of civilization, a kingdom of gods, gold, and eternal wisdom. But beneath that shimmering surface lay something far more primal and unnerving. Along the fertile banks of the Nile, where the morning sun kissed endless fields of papyrus, the Egyptians built a society obsessed not only with death, but with the control of life itself. And in that pursuit, they crossed boundaries no other ancient culture dared to approach. Sexuality in Egypt wasn't confined to passion or reproduction. It was an instrument of divine power, a sacred mechanism believed to keep the entire universe in motion. Every act of intimacy, every ritual touch was thought to echo through the cosmos, ensuring the flooding of the Nile, the growth of crops, and the favor of the gods. It was a system where the human body was not private property but a vessel through which the gods could act, bless, and sometimes punish. In the royal courts and temple corridors, this belief turned into a hierarchy of control, one that used pleasure as a form of domination. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was a living conduit between the physical and the divine. His virility was seen as the heartbeat of the empire, the pulse that determined the rhythm of nature itself. If his desire faltered, the Nile might not rise. If his seed failed, the crops might wither. To sustain this illusion of divine potency, priests and attendants crafted elaborate rituals where sexuality became both spectacle and sacrifice. The pharaoh's private life was anything but private. His intimacy was monitored, recorded, and sanctified as a cosmic necessity. Within temple walls, ceremonies were conducted that blurred the lines between faith and frenzy. Female priestesses, chosen for their supposed purity, were prepared for sacred unions with the divine king, acts that were both physical and symbolic, meant to fuse mortal flesh with godly will. The rituals were performed under moonlight, with chants echoing through halls inscribed with hieroglyphs depicting divine copulation. Every breath, every movement, was recorded in mythic language, as if each act could summon the gods themselves. But not all participants entered willingly. Beneath the sacred facade lay a machinery of control that exploited bodies, particularly those of slaves and servants, under the justification of religious order. These acts were framed as spiritual offerings, yet in truth they often served the desires of those in power, turning faith into a mask for indulgence. Evidence of these rituals doesn't come from rumors or modern imagination. It comes from temple inscriptions and papyrus texts buried for millennia. Records that detail union ceremonies between priests and chosen attendants, between nobles and slaves, between the living and even the dead. To the Egyptians, the boundary between life and death was porous, and sexual energy was seen as the force capable of bridging it. The same energy that brought life into the world could, they believed, guide the soul into eternity. That's why even in mummification, the body was not simply preserved but prepared for what they called the second birth. In these rites, the dead were often adorned with fertility symbols, and in some cases their sexual organs were artificially altered or preserved to ensure they remained potent in the afterlife. It was a belief system that viewed death as a continuation of intimacy, a cosmic exchange that never truly ended. When modern archaeologists began uncovering this evidence in the 19th century, they were confronted with findings that shattered the romantic image of Egypt as a purely intellectual civilization. hidden chambers decorated with scenes of ritualized copulation, papyri describing the use of aphrodisiac substances during temple ceremonies, and mummified remains showing surgical alterations of the reproductive organs. All of it painted a picture that Victorian scholars could neither comprehend nor tolerate. Many of these findings were quietly removed, destroyed, or hidden in museum basements, labeled simply as unclassified artifacts. What they revealed was not just an ancient fascination with the body, but a complete theology built around it, one that treated sex as a key to power, immortality, and cosmic harmony. To understand ancient Egypt, one must abandon the comforting idea of a culture defined by order and reason. Beneath its monumental beauty lay a world ruled by impulses it tried to sanctify. The Egyptians didn't see intimacy as sin. They saw it as sacred duty, but in elevating it to divine law, they transformed it into something monstrous. Pleasure became obligation, desire became ritual, and what began as reverence for life became a labyrinth of manipulation, cruelty, and control. This was not decadence born from luxury, it was faith turned inward until it devoured itself. And as the Nile flowed endlessly, giving and taking, flooding and receding, so too did Egypt's cycle of creation and corruption continue, written not in stone or scripture, but in the bodies of those who served the gods in ways too dark for history to remember. The first discovery that truly shattered Egyptology's innocence did not come from some grand pyramid or long-forgotten tomb buried beneath the desert sands, but from the silence of a small, lamp-lit laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team, still basking in the triumph of uncovering Tutankhamun's tomb, had begun the careful process of studying the boy king's remains. At first, everything seemed typical: the amulets, the gold leaf, the fragrance of ancient resins still clinging to the linen wrappings. But as the final layers were removed, the tone in the room shifted from awe to unease. The genitals of the young pharaoh were gone, not eroded, not lost to decay, but cleanly removed with surgical precision. The incision bore all the hallmarks of an intentional act, executed by someone with medical knowledge, performed shortly after death. For weeks, Carter's assistants avoided discussing it aloud, fearing ridicule or worse, discovery by their patrons. But the implication was clear. Something in Egypt's death rituals was far more invasive, more deliberate, than anyone had ever imagined. As the decades passed and technology evolved, similar examinations of other royal mummies began to expose a disturbing pattern. Several pharaohs, nobles, and high priests showed identical evidence of deliberate modification or complete removal of sexual organs. Others bore signs of physical alteration, the insertion of foreign substances into their bodies, symbolic carvings around the pelvic region, and even marks suggesting rituals performed while still alive. To modernize, these details suggested cruelty. To the Egyptians, they were acts of sanctification. The body, in their belief, was not only a vessel but a temple through which divine power flowed. To modify it was to prepare it for transformation, a final offering to the gods of fertility and resurrection. The papyri and funerary texts discovered alongside these remains only deepened the mystery. Some scrolls contained meticulous instructions for what they called the renewal of divine essence, a process describing how the dead should be purified through the removal or enhancement of reproductive symbols. The goal, as the texts claimed, was to make the deceased more perfect, a being whose body was freed from the impurities of human desire, yet eternally potent in the afterlife. In this paradox, they sought transcendence through mutilation, believing that divine perfection required the erasure of mortal weakness. And so, death became not a quiet passage, but a violent ritual of spiritual engineering. Victorian scholars, steeped in the prudish morality of their time, found themselves unprepared to face this truth. When the first explicit descriptions of these procedures surfaced in the early 20th century, they were swiftly suppressed. Museum curators ordered reports edited, illustrations destroyed, and terminology softened to the point of absurdity. Anatomical irregularities, they called them, a phrase meant to disguise the horror of deliberate castration performed in the name of eternal life. Entire sections of excavation journals were rewritten to avoid any mention of sexual modification, while artifacts linked to these practices were quietly placed into restricted collections, inaccessible to the public. What was hidden was not only the brutality of ancient ritual, but the uncomfortable reflection it cast on human nature. that even the most advanced civilization on Earth could cloak violence in the language of holiness. The Egyptians believed that every sexual act mirrored the primal union of their gods. Osiris and Isis, the divine couple who gave birth to life itself, served as the blueprint for human creation. But where mythology inspired reverence, religion demanded repetition. Priests imitated divine intercourse through ritual performance, believing that each reenactment renewed the balance between life and death. The problem, however, was that in codifying desire into doctrine, Egypt turned passion into obligation. When the Nile failed to flood or crops withered in the fields, priests sought explanations not in science, but in sacrifice. If the gods were displeased, the fault lay in the impurity of human ritual, and to correct it, the ceremonies became increasingly desperate, increasingly violent. The living body became an altar upon which the empire's fears were offered, dissected, and reassembled in the pursuit of cosmic harmony. When archaeologists finally dared to publish fragments of these findings, the world reacted with disbelief. Newspapers called them hoaxes, theologians dismissed them as slander, and museum officials refused to exhibit the evidence. But those who had seen it firsthand described something impossible to forget: mummies whose bodies were bound with cords at the thighs, inscriptions invoking fertility deities over surgically altered remains, and relief carvings depicting priests performing rites that blurred the line between devotion and desecration. For the ancients, it was all one and the same. To touch the divine, one had to suffer, to break, to become more than human. Even now, many of these artifacts remain locked in the dark corners of museum basements, catalogued under false names. Their true nature exists only in private archives and whispered recollections of the few researchers who dared to study them before being silenced by academic boards. What they reveal is not just a chapter of Egyptian history, but a mirror held up to humanity itself, a reminder that the boundary between worship and obsession is perilously thin. And yet, what you've heard so far is only the beginning. Because as disturbing as these mummification practices were, they pale in comparison to what was uncovered next. Rituals not of the dead, but of the living, where entire temples became theaters of intoxication, pain, and divine madness. What happened inside those walls would make even the horrors of the tomb seem merciful. Among the most disturbing revelations buried beneath Egypt's golden image was the fate of those born into its temples, children who never knew the meaning of innocence. In the eyes of their society, these children were not individuals but offerings, vessels through which divine energy was meant to flow. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that lined the walls of Thebes, Memphis, and Abydos describe them with reverence, calling them servants of the Netjeru, servants of the gods. Yet when archaeologists began translating these texts, the reality behind the language of holiness revealed something unspeakable. To be chosen as a temple child was not a blessing, it was a sentence, one written in ritual, blood, and silence. From the moment they could walk, these children were taken from their families and dedicated to sacred training. They lived within the high stone enclosures of temple complexes, surrounded by priests who claimed to prepare them for divine service. What this preparation entailed defied comprehension. Ancient papyri describe a curriculum of control, physical, emotional, and sexual conditioning meant to mold the child into a being of complete obedience. They were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves but to the gods. They learned postures and motions designed to channel the divine, positions that echoed the iconography carved into temple walls, where deities were shown in acts of union symbolizing creation. To the priests, this was sacred mimicry. To the children, it was slow annihilation of self. The training was relentless. Before dawn, they were bathed in cold river water, anointed with oils, and forced into prolonged states of stillness under the supervision of senior attendants. Meals were sparse, designed to keep their bodies lithe and youthful, the preferred form described in temple scrolls. Those who resisted were starved or beaten until they complied. Medical papyri discovered in the 20th century describe procedures meant to preserve divine form, including forced fasting, painful stretching of limbs, and the administration of narcotic mixtures derived from lotus and poppy. These concoctions dulled their pain but heightened suggestibility, leaving the children trapped in a haze between reality and ritual, unable to distinguish worship from violation. At the height of initiation, they were introduced to the rituals of the second sun, ceremonies that combined music, incense, and rhythmic movement with acts that modern minds would classify as abuse. Every motion was recorded as divine choreography, every violation was reinterpreted as offering. The priests justified their actions with doctrine, claiming that through these children the gods could taste the pleasures of mortal life. Families of high status considered it an honor if their offspring were chosen for temple service, even though whispers circulated of those who never returned. For every child elevated to sacred rank, dozens perished from exhaustion, infection, or despair. In some burial sites, archaeologists found small coffins hidden behind temple walls. Bodies of children no older than 7, wrapped in linen, marked with symbols of fertility deities rather than funerary gods. Their deaths were documented not as tragedy, but as sacrifice. What makes this truth so harrowing is not only the suffering itself, but the systematic justification that sustained it. Egyptian theology fused creation and destruction into a single cycle. Pain was seen as purification, pleasure as divine communication. By weaponizing this belief, priests created an unbreakable machine of control. Slaves, concubines, and temple children all existed within the same sacred hierarchy of submission. They were told that their suffering kept the universe in balance, that their tears watered the fields and their blood ensured the Nile's return. In that twisted cosmology, to be violated was to serve, and to resist was to defy the gods themselves. Archaeological and textual evidence of these practices surfaced slowly and controversially. During the late 19th century, a French Egyptologist working near Dendera uncovered a series of papyri written in unusually coded language. When deciphered, they described training methods for divine vessels, including the use of instruments to induce obedience and prolonged sensory deprivation as preparation for holy service. The academic world was horrified. The documents were quietly removed from circulation, their contents labeled indecent and archived under restricted access. Only fragments of the translations survive today, scattered among private notes of early Egyptologists who dared to preserve what official institutions sought to erase. Those few who studied the texts noticed something chilling: references to emotional detachment as a virtue. The children were praised for learning how to feel nothing, for mastering the art of silent surrender. This psychological conditioning stripped them of individuality until they existed only as extensions of ritual. Modern trauma psychologists examining these texts centuries later recognized the same symptoms that appear in victims of chronic abuse: dissociation, amnesia, and emotional paralysis. Yet for ancient Egypt, these qualities were celebrated as divine virtues. A perfect servant of the gods was one who could endure infinite pain with serenity, who could smile while breaking. In the quiet chambers beneath the temples, the cycle of exploitation continued for generations, uninterrupted by conscience. To the outside world, Egypt remained the marvel of the ancient age, a beacon of art, mathematics, and celestial wisdom. But within its sanctuaries, a darker wisdom ruled, one that believed divinity demanded suffering and that the price of cosmic order was human flesh. The walls of those temples still stand, weathered by sand and time, their carvings serene and beautiful. But behind the perfection of those hieroglyphs lies a history of trembling hands, stolen childhoods, and sacred lies, a story the gods themselves seemed determined to bury beneath the desert. For centuries, the priests of Egypt promised that every act of devotion, every ritual of pain, kept chaos at bay. Yet there came a moment each year when that very chaos was summoned on purpose, invited to consume the empire in an orgy of delirium. It was called the Festival of Hathor, though later generations whispered a truer name: the Feast of Divine Madness. What began as a gentle celebration of fertility and rebirth slowly evolved into a nightmare of intoxication and ritualized violence so extreme that foreign visitors refused to record it. In myth, it was born from the story of Sekhmet, the lion goddess of destruction, whose thirst for blood nearly ended humanity. The gods, desperate to save creation, poured rivers of beer dyed red with ochre, so that she would believe it to be blood. Drunk on illusion, Sekhmet forgot her rage and transformed into Hathor, the goddess of pleasure. The Egyptians reenacted this transformation every year, believing that by losing themselves in excess, they could prevent the goddess from awakening again. But what began as symbolic renewal descended into something far darker, a state-sanctioned frenzy that erased every boundary between worship and insanity. Preparations for the festival consumed entire cities. Months in advance, temples brewed vast vats of beer infused with blue lotus, mandrake, and honey, a combination that produced not mere intoxication but hallucination. When the first moon of the flood season rose, processions filled the streets carrying statues of Hathor draped in gold, while drums pounded like the heartbeat of the Nile. As night fell, wine flowed freely, and the people of Egypt, nobles, slaves, priests, and even children, were told to abandon restraint, to drink until the world blurred, to dance until their bodies no longer obeyed them, to surrender to what the priests called the laughter of the gods. What followed was not laughter but screaming. The ritual demanded that all social order dissolve so that divine balance might be renewed. In practice, it became a theater of cruelty. Men and women copulated in public squares as priests chanted hymns that grew steadily more frenzied. Violence and pleasure fused until they were indistinguishable. The same hands that lifted goblets in worship became instruments of violation. Blood mingled with wine on the temple stones, and the air itself reeked of incense and sweat. Eyewitness records from neighboring civilizations, fragments of tablets preserved in Mesopotamia and Cyprus, describe envoys who arrived during the festival and fled in horror. They wrote of nobles collapsing in drunken ecstasy, of slaves forced into participation as offerings, of children wandering naked through the crowds, their faces painted with symbols of fertility. The priests insisted that during those 7 nights, no act could be sinful because all acts were divine. The gods themselves had entered the bodies of the faithful, erasing human responsibility. That belief gave birth to unimaginable atrocities. Archaeological excavations at Dendera and Edfu reveal chambers beneath the temples filled with altars stained by organic residue and fragments of bone. Inscriptions describe them as places of renewal, though the evidence suggests something closer to sacrifice. Some walls depict figures writhing together beneath the gaze of Hathor's image, their limbs entwined in chaotic worship while musicians play to drown the cries. The festival's climax came with the sunrise on the 7th day, when the high priest proclaimed that the goddess had been appeased and the world was once again safe from destruction. But for many, the safety came too late. Bodies littered the banks of the river, trampled by the crowds or consumed by fever. The survivors awoke with no memory of what they had done, their minds blank except for a lingering sense of guilt that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Economically and politically, the festival served its purpose. It allowed the common people to vent the frustrations of servitude, to experience for a brief moment the illusion of equality before returning to obedience. Pharaohs understood its utility. A population that purged its madness once a year was easier to control for the remaining 358 days. Yet the cost of that control was spiritual rot. Year after year, the line between faith and delirium blurred until the two were one and the same. Children conceived during the feast were considered offspring of the goddess, yet many were abandoned or sacrificed in later rituals meant to purify the temples. The priests claimed that each sacrifice fed the sun with life force, ensuring its rebirth at dawn. In truth, it fed only the hunger of those who ruled in the name of gods who no longer listened. By the late dynastic period, foreign observers described Egypt as a land both magnificent and cursed, a civilization radiant with art yet drowning in its own excess. Attempts by later rulers to restrict the festival met fierce resistance from the priesthood, who warned that suppressing Hathor's celebration would anger the heavens and bring drought. When the Greeks and then the Romans arrived, they saw not divine mystery but moral decay. Cleopatra herself attempted to reform the rites, shortening their duration and forbidding public violence, but even she could not break centuries of spiritual addiction. In private, the old rituals continued behind closed temple doors, where wine, lust, and faith intertwined in the same suffocating rhythm. The Feast of Divine Madness endured until Egypt itself fell to the Empire of Rome, leaving behind only whispers carved into the sandstone, confessions of ecstasy and guilt, of worship turned to obsession. To gaze upon those carvings today is to feel the echo of that ancient intoxication, the heartbeat of a people who sought salvation through surrender and found only ruin. What began as a prayer to the gods became a mirror held up to humanity's darkest desire, to lose oneself completely, even if it means being consumed by the divine. When the Roman legions finally marched into the valley of the Nile, they expected to find a civilization in decline, exhausted by centuries of decadence. What they discovered instead was something far more unsettling: temples filled with carvings that glorified sacred copulation, altars drenched in remnants of strange oils, and priests who still whispered hymns of fertility to the statues of their gods, even as the empire around them crumbled. The conquerors were horrified. To them, this was not religion, but blasphemy. Augustus Caesar himself, after hearing reports from his officers, ordered an immediate suppression of all erotic rites. Temples dedicated to Hathor and Min were closed, the most explicit murals defaced with chisels, and scrolls containing sexual rituals burned in public squares as examples of moral purification. The Romans called it cleansing, but what they really did was bury centuries of knowledge they could not comprehend. The cult of divine intimacy that had once bound Egypt's faith to its cosmos was now redefined as depravity. Yet despite the fires, fragments of those forbidden texts survived, hidden within tombs, sealed behind false walls, carried by fleeing priests who believed that erasing pleasure from faith was a greater sin than the acts themselves. In the centuries that followed, the silence deepened. Egypt's old religion withered under foreign rule. The sacred prostitutes of the temples vanished, the priesthood disbanded, and the children once trained for divine service were abandoned to poverty. Those who had survived the system carried scars both visible and invisible. They had been shaped by doctrines that taught them their worth was measured through pain and submission, and when those doctrines collapsed, so did their sense of identity. Ancient texts refer to them as the hollow ones, souls without purpose, unable to live as mortals after being molded as offerings. Some took their own lives beside the Nile, believing that the gods they had served would at least remember their suffering. Others drifted into secret sects that attempted to keep the old ways alive in the shadows, blending Egyptian mysticism with fragments of Greek philosophy. But as the centuries passed, even those whispers faded, and the last remnants of Egypt's forbidden faith disappeared beneath the desert sands. It was not until the early 19th century that their world began to re-emerge. European explorers, driven by curiosity and imperial hunger, descended upon Egypt's ruins with shovels, lanterns, and a Bible in hand. They expected to find noble tombs and heroic inscriptions. Instead, they uncovered chambers filled with scenes that violated every moral code of their era: frescoes depicting orgiastic rituals, statues carved in explicit positions, papyri describing rites of sexual initiation. The shock was so profound that many refused to document what they saw. Giovanni Belzoni, one of the earliest explorers, ordered several murals plastered over before his team could sketch them. Others quietly sold artifacts to private collectors who promised secrecy. What could not be hidden was destroyed. Fire became their censor's ink, erasing thousands of years of evidence with a few seconds of Victorian shame. By the mid-1800s, the suppression had become institutional. The museums of London and Paris began locking away Egyptian artifacts in unmarked rooms labeled simply as restricted. Translations of ancient medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus, deliberately omitted sections that described reproductive practices or fertility magic. Scholars who attempted to publish studies on Egypt's sexual symbolism were ridiculed, expelled from academic societies, or accused of moral corruption. The world wanted pyramids and pharaohs, not the truth about how those monuments were consecrated with rituals of flesh and ecstasy. Even today, many of those artifacts remain unseen, catalogued under vague descriptions, or misfiled entirely. Behind the polished glass of museum halls lie thousands of pieces that tell a story the modern world is still too uncomfortable to face. A story of how the line between sanctity and sin was not destroyed by time, but deliberately erased. The greatest irony is that what the Victorians tried to hide was not a tale of barbarism, but of human contradiction. The Egyptians believed that creation itself was born from union, that the divine was not separate from the body but expressed through it. In trying to purify religion of the flesh, later empires stripped away the very essence of what had made Egypt's spirituality so powerful and terrifying. Their gods were not distant judges. They were living forces woven into every pulse of blood, every breath, every trembling act of passion. To the modern mind, their rituals appear grotesque, yet to them they were acts of cosmic balance, an attempt to keep the universe alive through the most primal of energies. And so, 3,000 years later, All that remains are fragments, a few surviving texts, a handful of murals, and the haunting knowledge that the truth about Egypt was never lost by time, but buried by choice. The sand covers their temples, but the echo of their rituals lingers, whispering that faith and obsession, holiness and horror, often share the same face. If this glimpse into history's forbidden side has left you questioning what else lies buried beneath the stories we're told, then you've only begun to scratch the surface. Because Egypt's darkness was not unique, it was merely the first chapter in humanity's long struggle between divinity and desire. To uncover what came next, click the video appearing now on your screen. And if you want to keep exploring the truths history tried to erase, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and join me as we continue unearthing the secrets the world was never meant to remember.